optionseducation.org, we're constantly updating and broadening the scope of the educational resources that are there. We do a lot of in-person events. We sponsor and work in conjunction with lots of firms, and we do things like go in and do options presentations there to the RIA community. We have so many parts of our education that are pointed directly at the actual retail user, but there's a whole subset of people that are RIAs, that are investment managers, that are actually doing a little bit of the heavy lifting as far as, and they're actually using options on a daily basis. So we go to where they are and we try to do things that actually inform them about options as well.
What is the history of the Options Industry Council?
It started as a collective in 1993 to better educate the public as to the risks and benefits of exchange-traded options. And OIC itself, the Options Industry Council, is a non-for-profit within the larger organization of OCC. And so we are fully funded by OCC, which happens to be a great relationship because that means that we can go out there and give unbiased information about options and try to help people understand both the risks and the benefits of how these options and these contracts, they're leveraged instruments, right? It's important that people understand that. We do that through lots of different methods. We do webinars, podcasts, we have a YouTube channel. All of these things combined are part of our, wide array of option-centric educational assets that we host on our website, optionseducation.org, which is a fantastic resource where we keep all of those centrally located for people to access. Anyone can access that once they start a login with us. They can access it on demand and free of charge, once again, because we're fully funded by the OCC. And so that's a really fantastic resource for the public as well.
How do you measure success?
High touch and low touch numbers. We're looking for ways and metrics that we can reach out to the investor and the end user of those options and be able to measure how much and how closely we are actually touching them from the use of our educational resources. So we measure things like views of videos, downloads of podcasts, things of that nature. And we also measure, just like anyone else does in our social channels, engagement and all of those metrics to make sure that we're utilizing the technology that exists out there to actually understand who that end user is and how they're actually interfacing with our content like that.
How can I arrange for the OIC to conduct a local seminar?
The first thing that I would recommend that people do is go first to optionseducation.org and start to look at the suite of educational resources we have there. But if you want to get in touch with us directly, we have an email address that goes directly to the investor education desk where I sit with 4 other colleagues. And amongst us, we have 100 years of combined options trading and the brokerage experience, et cetera. But that email address is options@theocc.com. That comes into a shared email box that is then looked at by the investor education team. And if you're looking for a way to get in touch with us in that regard, that's a perfect avenue to get in touch with us and to request something like that. Just as an aside, we do an awful lot of events like that, where we actually go out to, as part of our educational outreach, and do things like that, where we do option seminars, or we do a lot of virtual webinars, obviously, but we also do a lot of in-person events as well.
Why is education so important for options?
Options are leveraged instruments. That's a big part of the optionality that exists there. They're leveraged. And so part of what I honestly believe, from the core of my being, is that part of the optionality needs a certain amount of education to actually be able to allow people to understand the risks that are inherent within the optionality. Optionality is an interesting thing, and it acts differently depending on where that option might be in its life cycle, where it might be as far as things like its implied volatility levels, skew, kurtosis. There are all kinds of really, slightly more complicated parts of how options are priced. I think at OIC, we do a pretty good job, an admirable job of breaking those really complex things down into more digestible and understandable parts of that educational process. But I think that the inherent optionality and the leverage that's there is important for people to understand. And I think that's part of what we're trying to get to as far as educating people on how those options work.
What kind of math does an options trader need to know?
There's various different levels of math, and I think it depends on how deep you want to get into it. Obviously, there's a couple of really standardized models that exist as far as how options are priced. One of them is the Black-Scholes model. One of them is Cox-Ross-Rubinstein that people use. The difference between those is that one of them has a space for a dividend and one of them doesn't have a space for a dividend in the actual calculation. As far as math is concerned, I don't think you necessarily need to have expert level calculus and be able to find the area under a curve using trapezoids or anything to actually dive in to this marketplace and the education part of it. I think what you need is a general level of curiosity as to how these things work, and then and a baseline level of the math that exists there in those contracts. The more complex that you start to make these option trades, like adding different strikes and different quantities, and particularly different durations to an options life cycle, and then adding them all together into one larger position can get pretty complicated. But there are also a lot of programs and interfaces, particularly with brokerages that offer those, that are part of how people actually interface with the marketplace. And those programs oftentimes incorporate those models and do a really good job of helping people to actually manage and understand their risk. One thing that I think is really important is that you understand what models are you don't necessarily need to understand the model itself, but I think it's important to educate yourself as to what model am I actually using? Because oftentimes that's not the actual headline of the piece of software that you're using, right? And asking kind of probing questions about what kind of model are we using here, and then doing a little bit of research as to maybe the risks and benefits that exist with that model particularly, so that you can be well educated as to what you're actually looking at when you look at your options risk screen.
What is in the future for the OIC?
There's a couple of things that have just actually rolled out. That we have option tools on our website that have actually just been revamped and expanded and rolled out in Q1. So I want to make sure I highlight that. That's something that has just happened, and we've seen a huge uptake in the amount of people that are using that site and interfacing and using those actual tools on a daily basis. So the response there has been fantastic. And then we're also thinking about moving into more in-person events in the future. We're talking with a lot of our clearing member firms to work in conjunction with them to try to create more in-person events that give us educational opportunities going forward as well.
What trends are you seeing in education?
What we're seeing now is a mirror of what we're seeing also more broadly in the entire industry, which is the democratization of things like access. And that includes investor education, the democratization of access to information, again, unbiased information that comes to the investor where they are. That's a huge part for what we're trying to do. I heard Steve Quirk from Robinhood say 97% of people execute their options on their phone, on their platform. That's a massive shift in the way that our business works, but also in the way that we can look at it and actually point our educational resources that direction. Because if we know that people are doing that, we need to be going and meeting them where they are with that education. And so I think that's a big part of how this is going to change going forward. The secondary part of it, I think, is that as a culture more broadly, I think we are starting to shorten duration of many, many things, namely our attention span sometimes. But also, I think what that means is that the attention span of someone who's going to look at something from an options education perspective has previously been maybe 5 to 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes. And now it's moving more towards people want things that are 2 minutes long, 3 minutes long. And I think that's a big shift as well. That's something that we also have been talking a lot about on the investor education team, that we can do things that help us to meet them where they are when they only have 2 minutes of time. to think about and learn about options.
What kind of questions are people asking?
Some of them are about just general optionality, and oftentimes we'll find that people need to understand the actual basics of what they have in their account more to be able to understand how their risks are moving around. We get questions about exercise and assignment a lot of times. We also get a lot of questions about most of the most common strategies that exist out there: covered calls, protective puts, things like risk reversals, combos. Those option strategies are the most commonly used. And so we get a lot of questions about the dynamics and the risk dynamics that exist for those option strategies. What's interesting about how we answer questions is that we're not registered investment advisors. And so we can't direct you on a trade or give you, strategies to employ yourself. But what we prefer to do is to actually say, this is how calls generally work. This is how covered calls generally work. And these are some of the list of risks that you need to have on your radar if you're going to be adequately assessing your own risk when you have this position on.
What are the biggest misconceptions that you work to correct?
Options trading, because of its inherent leverage, can be particularly sticky when people don't necessarily understand things like contract multipliers and sizing of positions and what that means relative to calculations as far as risk are concerned. One thing that I think is really inherent within this process is that optionality and duration, the actual time that this option has until it expires, are directly linked, and that shorter term options behave in a much different way than a longer term option does. And so that messaging, I think, is really important when you take into account that move toward the shorter dated options. I think it's important that people understand that that's the dynamic that's at play when they decide to trade options that are of a shorter duration, that they need to understand how that actually affects the optionality and the leverage and all of those risk matrix issues.